Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to do another little Overwatch League news type recap. There were some things that happened over the past week that I wanted to talk about, so let's just jump in and talk about them. And we're going to start with the big news, which is the Dallas Fuel signing Pine to be their new hitscan player. Of course, XC retiring right before the start of the season. They managed to win the main melee without hitscan, but they are going to now bring in a new hitscan player, which is Pine. For those of you who are somewhat new to the Overwatch League, people who watched in 2020, 2021, or even in 2019, you may not know who Pine is. Now, Pine, the last time we saw Pine in the Overwatch League was actually the 2019 All-Star Game. He played 0 maps throughout the entirety of the 2019 season for the NYXL and was then released from the team in 2020. Or for the 2020 season, and was not picked back up. I think he retired, spent some time streaming for the NYXL and Andbox, and then kind of went back to doing some just general kind of stuff, and kind of unretired with the hope of coming back into the Overwatch League for the future. And obviously this is his chance. He's been given the chance to finally try to make that return to the Overwatch League. And so, for the people who've never seen Pine play, Pine is an incredibly mechanically gifted player. His aim is unlike anything that a lot of players have possessed, right? He has that humongous, like, big impact level hit scan play, where he comes on the map, and you might get just incredibly dominant hit scan play. But he's not the most consistent player. He struggled with inconsistency back in 2018. He also struggled a lot with mental health issues as well, which I think were a big part of what kind of held him back. And I think that's something that some people don't remember as much. If you watch the most recent episode of Plat Chat, they talked about it, and they talked about Pine, and that kind of like late in the season, they were playing Sabiobi more on the Widowmaker and Libero more on the Widowmaker than they were Pine. And some of that was because of Pine leaving the team to return to South Korea for a bit to deal with those mental health issues that he had going on. And some of it was also just that you had a little bit more flexibility by putting Sabiobi on the Widowmaker, or by putting Libero on the Widowmaker, than you did by having Pine on the Widowmaker. Believe me when I say, there are very few players ever who have ever looked as good on Widowmaker and McCree as Pine. Now, Pine never played Ashe. Ashe was not a thing when he was in the Overwatch League. But to kind of give you a little idea of how good Pine was on the Widowmaker in his one season. He didn't even play a whole season. He really played like 3 stages. Granted, it was 40 games back then, so it's very heavily skewed towards players that played one season in Season 1 versus any other time. But to give you an idea of kind of where he stands, when you look at players with on Widowmaker and McCree specifically, Pine has the 10th most final blows of any player, ahead of the likes of DM, Striker, Fitz, Ants, Kai, right? Players who have only played like one season, so you kind of expect him to be above some of them. But players like Baby Bay, who played for a long time. Striker has played for a long time. DM is now in his 3rd season. He has probably played a similar amount of maps as Pine, maybe a little less because of he didn't play a ton last season, but he's been around a while. Godsby has been around a long time. Right? These are players who are really good, and you look at as some kind of legendary hit scan players, and Pine has more than them. It's not a perfect thing to look at, but it is pretty good. One of the things you can look at is that final blow to death ratio on those heroes, because that doesn't really matter based on how long you played. It just kind of tells you kind of where you are. Pine's all-time final blow to death ratio on McCree and on Widowmaker is 1.6. To put that into context, that is the same as DM, who, when you kind of compare, the time is very similar. 11 hours, 31 minutes for Pine. DM, 11 hours and 38 minutes. So very, very similar there. That's also the same as Sabiobi, as Saya player, as Surefour, as Kai, as Birdring. Better than Nene, better than Logix. So it is a very, very interesting stat to look at. That he is kind of one of those players that was historically good on McCree and Widowmaker. Now, he was not as good as the likes of Carpe, who has, I would say, the best all time. He has, like over a day of time on Widowmaker and McCree in the Overwatch League. The two highest are Eileen and EQO, but they have, EQO is 2 hours. Eileen is an hour and 22 minutes, so I don't really count those two. But Carpe has a lot. Decay has a really high one at 4 hours, though, as well. Happy with 15 hours is above him. Fleta has a high one. Exy at 7 hours. Once at 9 hours. So there are definitely some that have more playtime and the higher final blow to death ratio. But it is very noticeable and notable how much Widowmaker we saw out of Pine and Widowmaker and McCree, and where he actually ranks among some of those other players in the league. And so he is a player who was incredibly talented and did very, very well. He is still, to this day, with those 11 hours played, relatively high on the list of solo kills. I believe he's 8th all-time Widowmaker McCree solo kills at 203. Ahead of Happy, ahead of DM, ahead of Aunts even. So something very, very noticeable and notable about Pine was just he kind of could take those crazy flanks and win those fights. And so that's really what you look at with Pine, right? He brings the potential for those major, massive flanks and dominating hit scan performances, right? But we haven't seen that in a long time. We haven't seen Pine play on the Overwatch League level, or even just a general kind of competitive level, since 2018, since the first season of the Overwatch League. So we have to expect that Pine will probably not be at that same level now as he was back then. Maybe he can get there with some time, but it is something that is notable. If you've been watching my videos, you would know that I was actually very big on Nene being the player that the Dallas Fuel signed. We've seen him play recently. Obviously, he played for the NYXL for the past 3 seasons, past 2 seasons. Was successful for them in that hit scan role in 2019 and in 2020. Though definitely not the most successful hit scan player of all time. Interestingly enough, he is a younger player than Pine is. And so it is something to really kind of look at and consider where he is as a player, right? Pine is 23, right? He's not a really young player, but he definitely still has that potential to pop off incredibly on the DPS role. From what we've heard, I believe from the Dallas Fuel, primarily is that Pine impressed them a lot in scrims and tryouts back before the season started. And so they kind of kept an eye on him for a while. And then once XC retired, of course, they kind of had to fill that void. And maybe Pine's circumstances, having been so recently tied with the NYXL, makes it easier to acquire a visa for him and get him over to Dallas. It has been said, I don't remember where, but that the plan with Pine is that he probably won't play until the second half of the June Joust. Even then, we might not really see him until the Summer Showdown, because, just logically, we might, McCree might get banned, and so the Dallas Fuel might not need to play Ashe or Widowmaker. That might not be meta. The meta might be like Tracer Genji or something, which if it is, good luck. But who knows when we're going to see Pine, right, actually hit the server. But it's an interesting signing. It's a really important signing to me as a fan. Pine is one of my all-time favorite players. This map that I've been showing you in the background is the first map I ever watched in the Overwatch League. It's the first match I ever watched, right? Like, I was already an NYXL fan just because of like ties to New York and the New York Mets, but this map was when I was like, oh, this is incredible to watch, and this Pine guy is really good. So I want to keep watching just for this guy. And so for me, Pine's return is incredible, and I'm so happy that he's back. I wish him the best. The Dallas Fuel, it's funny to me, they're a team that I've never been a fan of, but they keep adding players that I really like. And so I will continue to support all of these players, and I am very excited for Pine to be back. I hope he does really well. I hope that he has a spot going forward in the Overwatch League, because he is one of those players that just, in 2018, he was such an energizing player. He was such a fan favorite, and he had such a great personality as well. And so I'm so excited for him to be back, and I cannot wait to see what he does on this Dallas Fuel roster. But now that we've talked about Pine for 10 minutes, let's move on and talk about the other news we have this week. There's two major things. You'll notice that I have the Fusion and Eternal match playing from the Summer Showdown Finals last season, because these are the two teams that I'm going to talk about. So with the Paris Eternal, obviously last week I talked about their departure, which was Neptuno leaving the team, and I mentioned that one of the players that they could add was Dridro, who is a French main support player who was playing for New Kings, who were just coming off of a big contenders run for the April tournament where they got first place. They won Contenders EU Season 2, and of course that is exactly what happens now as they bring him in to be their new main support. So he is the main support who will be filling in for Neptuno, and I think it is a pretty good signing. I don't think it makes me more or less confident in this team's abilities to succeed. He's a good player. He has definitely had some good performances in the past. I believe he was on the French World Cup team last year, or in 2019. I could be wrong. He may not have, because FD God may have been the player for that French team, but he is a player that I am definitely excited to see. He is very much known for his Mercy. He's a really good Mercy. I don't think his Lucio is as good as Neptuno, so it'll be interesting to see what happens. But I do think that it is going to be quite the change for this team to kind of adapt to this new team and this new addition of Dridro, which I am confirming he did not play on the World Cup team for 2019. So I'll see how he looks when he joins, but it'll be interesting to see. His Mercy, his Brig, very good. His Lucio, not quite as good, but I'm excited to see what happens going forward, and I'm hopeful that he will be able to bring a new look to this Eternal team that has actually impressed me quite a bit this season. They have not been as bad as I thought they were going to be. And so I am happy that we finally have this announcement. It didn't take very long for us to get it, and so hopefully Dridro does great things for this Eternal roster. Final bit of news is the Philadelphia Fusion have announced that Tobi and Hotba have been signed for the remainder of the 2021 season. Of course, they were there as kind of the emergency replacements for Poco and Funny Astro because of the visa issues that have been prevalent trying to get Asian work visas for these European players. And so they haven't been able to get them to South Korea, and so those are the players that they signed as kind of emergency relief. And I think this is a really smart signing. I think it's a great signing. I tweeted about it. I basically said, with the uncertainty that is going to surround these visas and the performance that they put up in the May Melee qualifiers, like, these two players bailed you out. They're veteran presences. You know they're going to be good, and even if they do get replaced when Funny Astro and when Poco come back, they provide so much as just kind of leaders and mentors in a way, right? They can provide that leadership even behind the scenes that's helpful to the team. And so I think that is really, really helpful, and I think that's why it makes sense to bring these players in and just keep them with you for the rest of the season. We don't know when, Poco and Funny Astro and EQO and Shockwave will be able to play for this team. I hope that it's sooner rather than later. We saw that Fusions actually was able to travel to South Korea And from what I've kind of seen, it's like a workaround, because the way it is currently, if you're in the U.S., you can, if you're in Europe and you want to travel to the U.S., you can't, because the U.S. currently has it that you can't travel from Europe to the U.S. if you've been in Europe for the past 14 days. But because South Korea has a mandatory 14-day quarantine, they kind of worked around it by saying Fusions is going to fly to South Korea, have his 2-week 14-day quarantine in South Korea, and then go from South Korea to Boston, because then he won't have been there, and you can be in South Korea for that kind of brief period on kind of like a tourist visa, or just on like a tourist passport. You can be there for 90 days. You can't do that, though, if you're someone who's going to go there and be working, and so you have to get a work visa, and that's where the issues have come in for these European players who need to go to South Korea, and these European players need to go to North America. And so that's kind of why there's some issues. So hopefully that is something that's resolved soon, but it's nice to see that the Fusion are going to invest in these two players who have done so much for them this season already, and I'm hopeful that this is a sign of good things to come in the future for this roster, and that the Fusion find some more success going forward, and that we see them continue to work well with whatever roster they decide to field. That is what I'm most interested in and excited for. So that's it for the news for this week. If you have any thoughts on it all, let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear from you. But that is all from me. Thank you so much for watching. If you want more videos like this in the future, consider liking and subscribing. And yeah, so that's all from me. Hope you're all staying safe and staying healthy. And until next time, bye-bye.